much going on. I mean, we've heard some of the governance and regulatory challenges in the previous session. Tell me from your perspective, what's been going on in the past 12 months?
Sure thing. Well, first, I must say, I can't believe it has been 12 months. I was just saying just backstage, have they shifted the timetable for this? Has it, surely it was 6 months ago, but apparently it's been 12. And for us, what a year it has been in terms of AI. I kind of wind back the clock to the winter of last year, and we were just publishing our flagship Tech Horizons report, which talks about all of the different trends we're seeing in technology and what they mean for data protection. And we were having a debate, do we include generative AI as kind of one of the big trends? And we said, no, actually, we weren't going to include it as a big trend for privacy, because we said, actually, lots of the issues surrounding generative AI were not new. Actually, they were AI in general has been around for a hell of a long time. The ICO's positions around AI have been around for a long time. And we didn't feel it was the right point for us to lean in then. Wind forward to spring, and we've got with the program a little bit. We start to see, so even though our positions around AI are clear, we start to see a real need to provide clarity for lots of people who are starting to dip their toes in terms of generative AI, starting to see potential use cases where they've never really engaged in this before, provide a lot more guidance and steer to the market. So we start to issue top tips for people who are looking to deploy generative AI in their contexts.
So give me an example of just when you say dipping your toes, what kind of organisations or sectors are we talking about?
We've all seen lots and lots of different organisations start to see the potential of this here. So, for example, organisations which are normally, perhaps not used to being touched by trends around automation, where it's perhaps the creative industries, or it might be a law firm that's looking to employ this actually for summarization or development of documents. And they've never really dabbled, I suppose, in this way before. But suddenly, actually, they're thinking, right, okay, well, I've got the opportunity to push this in, and probably putting a lot of personal data in there. What should I do? So wind forward then to summer of last year, and we launch our flagship innovation advice service, so that organizations can get clarity from us on questions where they're looking to interpret the law and apply it to new things. And we give responses back within 10 to 15 working days. The first slew of questions, it's fair to say, continue to come in through around applications of AI. Why wouldn't they? And so we're very, very busy trying to provide that clarity to the market. But at the same time, we start to sound a bit of a warning note, because some of the trends that we're seeing are actually of organizations seeing so much commercial opportunity in this space that they're hoping that they don't really have to think that hard about the privacy implications before they bring product out to market. And so we issue a warning at that time. We say that in terms of kind of major deployers or developers of these models, we will be looking to make sure that organizations have assessed the privacy implications. And actually, in October of this year, we announced that, of last year even, that we announced that we were issuing Snap Inc. with a preliminary enforcement notice in respect of their MyAI chatbot, and concerns that we had around assessment of the privacy risks in that space. I should say, for the lawyers in the room, that is a conversation that is still ongoing. We're receiving the representations, we're taking decisions. We've not yet taken a final decision in respect of that particular case. But I think that illustrates our intention to continue to scrutinise what is coming to the market and make sure that people are being protected.
Is there a regulatory gap? I suppose, speaking to the title of this session, really, a regulatory gap in data protection law as applied to AI. Are there cracks where companies, organisations are falling through? I mean, what's the trend here?
So we're really lucky in many respects with data protection law in that it was always envisaged as needing to respond to technological change. So it's principles based. And whilst the technology changes and evolves, the principles remain the same. It's just how we interpret them for those particular contexts. So actually, there isn't really a gap in respect of data protection law. We've not been subject to the same sorts of debates that have been happening around copyright, for example. But instead, I know that some of you have been hearing about the UK government's approach to regulation of AI more broadly. One of the jobs that we've got to look at is actually how well we coordinate with other parts of the regulatory ecosystem here, how well we're making sure that where there is existing law, we're joining up so that we're not creating unnecessary friction or barriers just by independent regulators taking different approaches. And equally, that where there are gaps between regulatory regimes, we're openly signalling those so that government and parliament can really consider whether those gaps should be filled and how.
And when you talk about the advice service that you're leading, that's the multi-agency. Is there a multi-agency aspect to that?
So you've given a sneak preview to what I was going to come on to a little bit later. So we already have within the ICO a single ICO-specific data protection innovation advice service. But actually, just coming up a little bit later this spring, we will be setting out a new offering, which is like that service that we provide, but actually joined up across 4 regulators, across the regulators within the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum. So that includes us, the Financial Conduct Authority, Ofcom as the Communications and Content Regulator, and the Competition and Markets Authority. Recognising that actually lots of people's questions cut across boundaries, and you need a joined up regulatory response. So really looking at how we can scale this sort of concept across regulators to provide people with informal advice so that people are able to stay the right side of the law when they're doing product development.
And do you think that this is working? This kind of approach is working because everything is moving so quickly. In this country, we've decided not to go down the statutory route. Is that you're confident that people are protected, sufficiently protected by what you do, by the coming multi-agency approach?
And the short answer is yes, actually. I think there's a lot to like in the approach that has been set out by the government. I should say we're an independent regulator, we don't have to say this. But in terms of kind of what they've done, they've seen, okay, yes, AI is this general purpose technology that is cutting across lots of different sectors, but actually the implications of it will be really quite different in different sectoral contexts. And just in the same way that we regulate human activity differently in different sectoral contexts, we're going to need to do so in the context of AI. And so we're going to need to build on our existing regulatory regimes, spot where there are gaps, spot where things need to be joined up, rather than apply a crude solution of a one-size-fits-all approach to regulating AI, not taking into account some of the different risks that might emerge in different contexts. So I think this is a good foundation to really enable us to tackle some of the risks in this space. It really relies, though, on having those mechanisms to join regulators up so that you don't get fragmentation. And I think that's something we're all really committed to.
Excellent. And before we move on to our question session, I just want to ask you, as you know, a representative of the ICO and someone who's regulating in this space, what would be your message to the delegates to this conference who are at the innovatory end, kind of looking at this very fast-moving field and perhaps not thinking sort of first and foremost about how it's going to pan out societally?
See, I don't quite believe that. I know from all of the people that I engage with on a regular basis that actually the issues that we're talking about, whether it's bias and discrimination, whether it's safety and security, whether it's transparency and explainability, are all issues that people in this room really care about and really care about getting right. And you know, maybe it's a happy coincidence that they all have a really great foundation in data protection law, or maybe actually that it's built around things that people really care about. So I've got, you know, at heart, I'm an AI optimist. I think that we have the potential to really get this right. And I really encourage people to, I suppose, lean into their own kind of human instincts, right, around how to get things right and make sure that that is designed into the process.
Excellent. So I'm going to go to some of the questions that we've got. The most popular question, actually, is sent in anonymously. Data protection is the last session of this two-day conference, and safety first has been the motto for AI deployment, which is quite an interesting observation. What does the ICO do for privacy first in AI? Interpret that how you will.
I'd like to think that we do a lot, but I would also argue that regulation is only one part of making safety and really kind of making public trust happen in AI. And actually, really, regulation, you want to act as the backstop, the safeguard in terms of how things are done. So really, the role of us as a regulator is around spotting where there are gaps, making sure that where we might be going off track, we're providing those sorts of warnings to the market like I've indicated, making sure that where we do have serious concerns, we're taking enforcement action. But really, actually providing that sort of guiding hand in terms of saying, here is what we think needs to be done in this space. That's the role that we're trying to play in this space.
Excellent. There's a really interesting question here, again sent in anonymously. Can the processing of personal data to create anonymized or synthetic data for the development of AI models be considered legitimate interest?
Wow. So I'm not going to, as you expect as a regulator, I'm not going to start giving out legal advice on stage in terms of exactly how to go about this. I think there is a really interesting debate, though, for us to have around the potential for privacy-enhancing technologies to lift out a lot of the sort of concerns, you know, around how AI is developed and deployed, away from some of the, you know, the harshest sort of elements of data protection law, if you will, by providing people with assurance that actually only the minimum amount of data is being, personal data, I hasten to add, is being processed for a particular purpose. So providing people with assurance around security and identifiability of data that is processed. So I think there's a huge amount of potential in this space. I think there is also a really interesting debate around, in that process of getting something to a pseudonymized state, what's the degree of control and work that we would expect, and also around how effective some of those tools for pseudonymizing and anonymizing data really are, particularly in a world where AI is developing and it's able to pick apart things that we might have previously thought were very good at perhaps covering up some of the original data.
Right, excellent, okay. We've got a question about the Digital Protection and Digital Information Bill. Does this draft legislation have any red flags for privacy?
Wow. So what I will say is that the ICO has provided pretty much a running commentary on the Data Protection and Digital Information Bill at each of the different stages. You can find our published responses at each of the different stages where we have set out what we think are the most important things to achieve through the data protection regime in any form, and our comments on the different elements. You can actually just find, we've literally just in the last fortnight published our latest take on the bill as amended, highlighting our broad support, but also some areas where we want to see some progress. So I do encourage people to dive in on that.
And can you broadly give us a sense of where your areas of concern might be?
So I won't go too deep into
No.
that because we've set those out really transparently. So I
Yeah.
don't actually have a huge amount additional to add in that. But what we have highlighted, for example, is some of our the points that we would raise around some of the measures, for example, to tackle benefit fraud that have been highlighted and some reflections around how we might like to see those measures evolve. But I'll leave people to review our carefully crafted public response around that one.
Sorry, I'll just checking through my questions here. Do you believe in the future of a certification or a licensing scheme to ensure AI meets certain criteria? Would that work? Kite marking, I guess.
So there's lots of different ways in which you can interpret that. I'm gonna take one interpretation of that question, and if the person is in this room and knows the angle they were intending, then please shout or scream, and I'll cover the other angles too. There's a lot of debate right now around the extent to which new regulation might be needed around foundation models, with a sense that actually there is a lot of regulation around sort of direct to customer deployment of AI, but actually that might not necessarily be addressing some of the risks that are inherent in foundation models upstream before those risks are then cascaded more broadly out. And wouldn't it be better for there to be some form of licensing regime or control around those models to mitigate some of the risks? What I would say around that is actually that data protection law applies evenly across the development and deployment of models. Where you are processing personal data, you are typically within scope of data protection law, and that means whether you're doing training, fine-tuning, etc., your activities are going to be scrutinised potentially by the ICO. So in terms of the questions that would come across our remit, whether it's questions around bias and discrimination in foundation models, whether it's questions around explainability and transparency, I'm very confident, actually, that we've got the ability to cover those with the powers that we've got. I think there are broader questions that are coming up around, for example, national security risks that might emerge from the deployment of these sorts of models, which are things that the data protection regime is not designed to cover off. And I think those are questions that definitely prompt this debate around whether or not these development of very advanced models in this space should be licensed, but they're kind of out with the scope of data protection.
Okay, excellent. When critical incidents and events happen, and I guess it's some of those that, you know, the ones we're talking about, when things go wrong, essentially, how joined up will regulators be in order to kind of make interventions?
So, and I think you can look at our track record around this. So the ICO with other leading digital regulators has been working together now for 4 years. And whilst we've not yet done any sort of major joint investigations or enforcement around AI, you can see the way that we have worked together on other matters. So if you shift dimensions for a moment and look at the phasing out of third-party cookies, the Competition and Markets Authority launched an investigation into Google's plans to deprecate third-party cookies. And the ICO has been engaged by both Google and by the CMA around those plans right from the start. Indeed, resulting in commitments from Google to the CMA around its plans for phasing out of third-party cookies, which provided both the ICO and the CMA with a role in scrutinising the next phases of that work, which is still ongoing. So I think you can be really confident that where we will need to, we will join up. Equally, I've heard the opposite view reflected to me, which is great, if something goes wrong, are we going to get a regulatory pile-on where you're all going to rock up to the party and start picking on us at once? And on that, I can say, rest assured, we all know our roles. It would be a terrible waste of regulatory resource if we were all to do that. And actually, we have to link any activity that we do to our statutory remits. So there's not really that much flexibility for us to all start covering the same sorts of issues. So yes, you'll join up in the right places, but also you'll get regulators running with things which are solely within their remit on their own without having to have all regulators involved, everybody scrutinising your activity all at once.
So it's about divvying up
Exactly so.
the responsibilities in the right way. There's an interesting one about, interesting question here about, where is it? Anonymous. And I do love in the fact that we're talking about data privacy, and so many people have chosen to send in their questions anonymously. It's really, really interesting. But anyway, the one question I wanted to ask was about wholesale data scraping by frontier large language model companies. Where does that fall in terms of your remit, regulation? How do we deal with that?
Well, look, this is one of the live issues that we're really focusing on right now. So I said that for the most part, actually, questions of how to apply data protection law to AI are largely settled matters. But actually, some of the technological developments and some of the practices, frankly, of the past year have exposed some areas where we need to have a debate around actually how should we apply certain concepts. One of those areas is web scraping. And particularly in the context of development of models where actually it might not be possible, or it might significantly close off the market to not use web scraping because you need that large volume of data. What's the right set of controls? So in January of this year, we set out the first in an ongoing consultation series around when organisations can argue that it's in their legitimate interest to scrape data from the public web in order to train models. You'll then see that we've got a series of other consultations that are going to emerge during the year. So we've got one out at the moment around purpose limitation for general purpose models. We've got ones that are coming up around, for example, what people should expect in terms of accuracy of outputs when the outputs might be classed as personal data, or how far your information rights should go when you're looking for your own personal data to be deleted from a model, for example. So we're starting to surface these trickiest questions. I really invite everybody in this room to reply to those consultations and to have your voice heard, because these are really big societal issues. We're only going to get this right if everybody joins that conversation.
Excellent. That's a really good place to end. But before I do that, thanks so much for all the questions online and here. I wanted to ask you just to tell me what's in your in tray. Like, give me the top 3 things that you're going to be thinking about in the next 12 months.
So it's very hard to cut it down to a top 3, and actually the biggest focus of our certainly policy thinking right now is going to be that series of consultations that I just set out. But I'll give you 2 extra ones on top of that. So one is that as part of that, we really need to think through how our own positions that we take are going to be joined up with those of other regulators. So the Competition and Markets Authority has done a very prominent piece of work around foundation models, but some of the trade-offs between open sourced and closed source approaches are going to be really difficult to work through, actually, from a privacy and competition perspective, and it's going to be really important that we start to point in the right answer. So we're going to set out a joint statement later this year on how we're both approaching those questions, that we're guiding the market in the same direction. And then finally, mindful of time, I'll say that going back to that Technology Horizons report that I started out with right at the start, we did talk about one trend that we're keeping a close eye on this year, and that is the trends around personalised large language models, and some of the opportunities that they really provide for people to have something that really represents their voice, etc., but also some of the risks.
Excellent. And I do realise we are out of time, but I've realised I've made an oversight of my own, which is not to ask anybody in this room to ask a question. If anybody would like to ask a question, I would love to take your questions. We do have a mic, but yes, we've got. I think the first person to put their hand up was this lady here. Thank you. And we'll take that very quickly before we
Hi,
wrap up.
yeah, thank you. That was really interesting. I'm curious to see what is your take on kind of, I'll term it social AI designed as a friend or relationship that we're kind of seeing more of. Do you think there'll be a repeat of what's happened in social media with, very personalized data extraction, very targeted advertisement, plus, I guess, the kind of social influence that, we're going to have? How is that being regulated now? Because it seems like there's kind of gaps already. And what's your take on that for the future?
So your take on data that's used in a sort of more of a social context on social AI?
Indeed. So look, I think you can see from our focus on Snap's My AI tool that this is an area of clear focus for us. I think there are both existing risks, but also some novel risks in this context in terms of the sorts of information that you might share with a conversational partner, a friend, which actually might be rather more intimate than you might post online, for example, if you're looking to get advice on something that you don't actually want to share with people. So I think there are some really interesting questions for us to explore here around what are people's expectations in that context. I think as you highlight, there are also some really interesting questions around how far does existing legislation go? I'm very comfortable, and I think you can see from our action, that when it comes to the data protection privacy risks, we've got those covered. But actually, when it comes to some of the content risks that come out from this, the online safety regime as it stands is focused on user-to-user communications rather than user-to-bot communications. And so there's an interesting question around if there's harmful content that's generated, which is not necessarily a data protection question, how is that covered off?
Thank you. And I think I'm going to leave it there with you, Stephen. I want to give a quick round of applause to Stephen for sharing that with us.